Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Ingrid Sorgard. I'm a Senior Content Manager here at Procurement Leaders, and as usual, I will be your host for today's session. Today, we're going to be talking about partnering through a time of transformation and bringing suppliers much closer to strategic business initiatives and treating them as partners rather than suppliers. It's an important evolution that we've seen in recent years. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about how we actually go about creating effective partnerships and partnerships that will essentially create long-term results that we're after and that the business needs. Now, I'm super excited and happy to introduce today's panelists, which are with me here in the virtual studio. I've got Joel Johnson, who's a VP Consulting for GEP, and also my colleague Nico Nemi, who is Executive Advisor here at Procurement Leaders. Now, I'm going to hand you over to you, please, to do a quick intro of yourself. Perhaps, Joel, I can start with you.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Ingrid. Hello, everyone. I'm Joel Johnson, Vice President of Consulting with GEP, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. GEP is a leading global company providing strategy, software, and managed services in the area of procurement and supply chain. And I've been with GEP for 15 years, and during that time, I've had the privilege to help lead procurement and supply chain transformation programs with a number of Fortune 500, Global 2000 companies across industries, working with these companies to enhance their org structures, build resilient processes, and enable sustainable value creation. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share some insights today and represent GEP's perspective on the partnership topic.
Great, thank you. Nico, your turn.
Hey everyone, my name is Nico. I work as an executive advisor at Procurement Leaders. So what that means is that I have the pleasure and privilege of speaking to a lot of chief procurement officers and their leadership teams on all things procurement. So whether it's about improving resiliency of your supply chains or working more collaboratively with your business partners, or digitizing procurement, which is a bit of a special focus area of mine. A lot of really interesting conversations that I get to have with these brilliant procurement executives within the Procurement Leaders network. So I'm really interested in hearing what Joel has to share about GEP's work in this space and just overall top tips around how to partner better with suppliers. And then, just bring some Procurement Leaders insights into the conversation as well. So really good to be here.
Amazing, thank you both. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So just very quickly before we delve into the session, just a little bit of an overview about what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to look at how we can bring two corporate cultures together and get an understanding of what each brings to the table, tying the partnerships to business and measuring success, and also leveraging AI and emerging technologies to enhance the relationship. Now, before we move on, just need to do some quick housekeeping. Nothing new here for those of you that watch this regularly. We do have additional resources which are available during and following the webinar, so please take some time to check these out. We really want to hear from you. As always, please submit your questions throughout the webinar. We will be doing a Q&A towards the end of the webinar, but keep those questions coming, please. Engagement is really, really key on this forum, and we might just tie some questions in as we go along. Again, feedback is important for continuous improvement. There'll be a very short survey at the end of the webinar, just a couple of seconds, so please take some time to fill that in. And also, if you have any technical difficulties, just check out the help section. There's lots of information there, or you can pop your question or your query through the question box and we will get back to you. Now, going to hand it over to Joel, please. Very excited to hear what you got to say, so over to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much. So let's go ahead and kick off with what is a partner and how is that different than a traditional supplier? So suppliers often selected through a traditional bid process. They provide goods or services in a standardized, normally transactional pattern for a period of time that conforms with some level of terms and conditions. When the transaction ends, the business relationship ends. It's really transactional in the truest sense of the word. Partner, on the other hand, is a tailored business relationship. It's based on mutual trust, openness, some level of shared risk and reward that ideally yields a competitive advantage. And even based on these simple definitions, you can already start to see why partnerships versus transactional relationships are so important when a business needs to pivot or adapt based on internal or external disruption in a time of transformation. So before we dive too deep into the content, I just wanted to set forth a guiding framework to help us organize the discussion. So what you see on the slide is our perspective on some of the pillars of a successful partnership. We start with culture and trust as the foundational element. This foundation really needs to be complemented with clear alignment on what are the partnership goals and a clear mentality of continuous improvement and disruption. And then a clear set of KPIs, incentives, penalty helps drive the partnership behaviors towards those strategic objectives, while a strong infrastructure in terms of operating model, RACI, other governance really enables the sustainable operations of the partnership. So over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll share some strategies across all these different dimensions, but also really try to complement those with some practical tools, examples to help build genuine and sustainable supplier partnerships. So with that, wanted to start with a few key considerations. The first one here is not all supplier relationships are partnerships. So to the last point, it's totally fine to have transactionally oriented relationships. In fact, clarifying what are transactional suppliers versus true strategic partnerships actually helps focus time and investments. And most more organizations have some mechanism to stratify the supply base. Within this stratification, some suppliers are deemed strategic as critical. You know, they're often candidates for a partnership approach. Typically managed service providers, external service providers, really in more of the less transactional areas require some level of business partnership, as do other core areas related to product design, development, potentially even marketing and distribution. Second point is partnerships have limits. So what collaboration doesn't require suppliers to run through walls to complete any jobs. It's more about collective problem solving. It's really to the benefit of both partners. So to take an example here, if a customer has a broken business process leading to lots of invoice delays and inconsistency, a partnership isn't expecting that supplier to bend over backwards over long periods of time to accommodate these inefficiencies. A partnership is actually working together to change the business process, which helps this customer in terms of many areas such as speed to market and broad improvements to their payment processes. And at the same time, it's helping the supplier who received swift payment for the services that they've rendered. Third point is about issues and talking about issues a lot. Question is, when is the last time you established a forum to discuss challenges with a supplier or a partner that wasn't a reaction to some sort of issue or disruption? We've really found there's immense benefits in carving out the time and space for some of these eye-level conversations and proactively surfacing issues. So in terms of tools, there's mechanisms we can use, such as performance surveys. They can be really helpful enablers. But if you're really taking the partnership approach, think not only about issuing that survey in order to evaluate the performance of the partner, but also having the partner respond and give a perspective on what it's like to work with your organizations and take those inputs seriously. Culture is more important than you think. And we'll get into the detail on culture in just a few minutes here, but we're being purposely provocative. We see cultural mismatches and communication issues as really an acute driver of partnership failures. And some of the most successful long-term partnerships are marked by strong cultural alignment. Be prepared to invest. So partnering inherently, it's a two-way street. It requires investment by both parties, but investment doesn't necessarily need to mean capital expenditures. It can come in a lot of different forms: providing a reference to help a supplier grow their portfolio of business, sharing intellectual property rights for jointly developed digital solutions, maybe setting up a program for some level of cross-organizational talent development. And then lastly, continually adapt. So this is a theme we'll cover throughout today's conversations. But while a partner's capabilities at one point in time may have been aligned with the marketplace needs, those needs change and the supplier's capabilities can fail to keep pace with that. Sustainability is a great example. So 2 or 3 years ago, science-based targets, tier 3 emission reduction goals, they weren't on the scorecard of a lot of procurement organizations. Now they are. They're commonplace. And in some organizations that pivot towards those sustainability metrics can actually be a disruptive force. So the contractual commercial frameworks you have in a partnership scenario really need to have the room to breathe and incorporate these evolving priorities, such as the sustainability goals. So moving on, in order to help bring some of today's concepts to life, I'd like to share a bit more about a transformational journey that we as GEP went on with a $50 billion global life sciences company. So the genesis of the relationship was one in which we as GEP provided more traditional sourcing support, supplier management activities for almost 10 years. And honestly, this relationship skewed a little bit more towards traditional supplier relationships and a true partnership. And then in 2020, there's a series of disruptive internal and external conditions that led this organization to completely overhaul their global procurement operating model. They quickly realized this wouldn't be possible without a true partnership. So through a transformation and transition period, we as GEP moved into that role of a strategic partner. Yes, the breadth and depth of our scope of services and solution evolved significantly. 200 plus team members operating across 20 countries, helping to manage thousands of sourcing events, more activity as it relates to category management, business partnering. But critically, our metrics, our governance, our ways of working also totally changed. And I'll draw upon some of these examples from this particular experience as we progress through our discussion today. In terms of disruption and transformation, this can take many different forms. Profitability improvements requiring org changes, new processes, it can be competitive threats, changing customer behaviors that really requires innovation. It can be rapid scaling to new international markets, mergers, acquisitions, divestiture, the list goes on. But in my experience, all of these disruptive or transformational environments require procurement in some way, shape, or form to step up to the table. In this particular example, the life sciences client I referenced, their internal disruptive forces was an imperative to reduce operating costs significantly within the procurement organization and more broadly within shared functions while increasing value-oriented metrics. And externally, there was a recognition that the market was moving beyond this sort of purely tactical support, and there were opportunities for them to tap into external category expertise, flexible resource delivery models. So basically, this organization, in a time of acute cost pressure, evolving external market decisions, made a decision to step up and embrace the change. So they committed to the large organizational restructuring to manage costs, but they also used this as an opportunity to address some of the more systemic weaknesses within their procurement organization. And through a holistic restructuring and partnership approach, they were able to attain these goals. And we'll talk a little bit more about how now. So with that backdrop, let's go ahead and dive into some of the specific dimensions of a partnership. And the first one is culture. So we know that at many times, assessing a partner or a provider based on culture can be viewed as fluff or maybe even treated as an afterthought. However, there's really, from our perspective, a lot to be gained and little to be lost by taking some time to truly investigate the culture of any prospective providers you have, particularly those that are operating in a strategic capacity. I think so much of our work is about people and how we connect. Ultimately, once we frame up the roles, responsibilities, governance, KPIs, and any sort of partnership, managed service, externalization program, a lot ultimately distills down to the personal relationships. So the client and partner cultures don't need to perfectly mirror each other. It's not possible. No two company cultures are identical, but from our perspective, they need to be complementary. So in the life sciences example I referenced, there are certainly differences between a typical client culture, a typical GEP culture, but the combined teams were able to successfully address a number of the differences. Some of that was about respecting the differences and working around them. And then others, required some level of adaptations. That being said, small fissures in terms of cultural misalignment can quickly turn into large voids, particularly in an environment of disruption and transformation from our experience. To use an example, if there's a transformation that's driven by example for global scaling or entry into a new market, a client that has a culture of risk-taking and failing fast is going to quickly come into conflict with a supply partner that has a very conservative culture of taking progressive steps, building consensus along the way. So basically, one organization wants to move fast, it's part of their culture. The other wants to move slow, it's part of their culture. Both of these are valid, but it's a problem. By taking time to understand culture up front, this sort of thing could be identified and mitigated. So perhaps it's through a different partner, or it's how the partner is set up and governed to contend with some of these foundational differences. So overall, take the time to assess cultural fit, really consider whether this is a supplier that you want to spend time with, you can learn from, whose vision will really evolve in concert with your organization's needs. And when there's alignment, then really allow the time for the relationship of mutual trust, respect, transparency to blossom, and by encouraging those behaviors that really live up to the cultural values and allow the partnership to thrive. Next area is strategic alignment. So in terms of strategic alignment, the best relationships are with suppliers that are really pretty deeply knowledgeable about your business and also whose capabilities you know pretty well. Furthermore, being clear and honest about what you want out of the relationship from our perspective is super important. This really sets the whole tone for the partnership. A common mistake we've observed is a misunderstanding behind the motivations of the partnership. And those assumptions can end up being completely different than reality. So, for example, if you assume a supplier is looking to advance their technology development, but in fact, their goal is to expand into new markets, that could drive the wrong partnership focus areas and misaligned investments. So how do we really reach this level of strategic alignment? Very basically, from what we've found, it's all about bringing leaders together early, ideally in face-to-face workshops, write down the partnership principles, openly share the motivations, and work together to develop a plan near midterm, and then also a vision. In this life sciences example I mentioned, we came together with the client leadership, procurement leadership team for several days to develop what we refer to as our lighthouse vision. So in summary, we were striving for exceptional collaboration and partnership in the area of procurement that others in the industry would really seek to emulate. And 3+ years into the partnership, we're frequently revisiting that lighthouse vision. We're assessing what needs to be adapted and how we're progressing towards those overall goals. Next area is innovation and disruption, which really gets to the core focus of today's context or backdrop with which we're discussing partnerships. I think there's a natural tendency for both partners to become complacent over time. So how do you stay sharp and ensure that you and the partner are prepared for the disruptive forces which will inevitably arise? So our perspective is that some of this can be embedded into the contractual frame of the partnership. So if efficiency was critical, as was the case for this life sciences example that I've mentioned, partnered with their procurement team, then set efficiency goals and be clear on what each party needs to do in order to contribute to bring those goals to fruition. So this could take the form of process improvement, digital tools, activity elimination. And in other contexts, if innovation is key, then set specific expectations related to innovation, but ensure there are forums in place to hear those ideas and that the organization is actually willing to implement those that make sense. Otherwise, from what we've seen, both partners lose motivation and the relationships tend to stagnate. So also, as we touched on earlier, staying ahead of disruptive forces also requires us to frame contract, the commercial, the partnership governance in a way that's not too rigid. Like there needs to be a focus on current scope, but also time set aside with senior leaders to discuss bigger picture topics, strategic topics. When disruptive forces do end up arising, there really needs to be enough breathing room to adapt. So we'll come on to a bit more detail in a few moments on metrics, but mentioning to the team earlier, it wouldn't be a presentation in June of 2023 if we didn't spend a little bit of time on emerging technologies and specifically generative AI. And I'm not going to review the content of this slide in detail, but in the context of our presentation, I'm sharing an example of how a strong partnership can help an organization be resilient through a time of transformation, specifically in the domain of procurement. Many clients don't have the internal capabilities, the solution, or are able to develop digital tools that we know now are evolving significantly month over month, even week over week. So this is really where a strategic partner that has the digital competencies as well as a strong understanding of the client environment can be a significant competitive advantage, whether it's in procurement, production, marketing, or other areas. Now, in the context of this specific partnership I've been referencing with the life sciences company, we've been able to plug in the past really 2 months many of these digital point solutions to help enable an agile digital transformation without really totally modifying or adapting the broader system ecosystem. Now, there's a whole nother angle to this that's outside of just the context of this partnership example is that these technologies are also helping enhance the relationships that we have with our supply partners. So to give a couple examples here related to what's on the slide, enhanced spend forecasting or demand planning allows partners to plan their production capacity or investment. We've seen supplier recommendation engines that can really help promote preferred supply partners at the appropriate time in the overall buying journey. And then tools like intelligent contracting dynamic clause libraries can really help speed up the cycle time, of course, with the appropriate level of controls, so that we can move past the contracting and into the execution, as part of many of these key supplier partnerships that organizations have. Then next, segueing to incentives and metrics. So measuring performance and outcomes is clearly foundational, and what to measure depends largely on the nature of the partnership. So we could spend hours talking about metrics. These vary a lot from what we've seen by industry or category area. A manufacturing partner versus an R&D partner versus a marketing partner is super different. But the key success factor that we found as GEP is, of course, to have that right level of operationally oriented metrics for baseline performance. I mean, that's the same principle that we have for transactional suppliers as well. In the procurement externalization example I've referenced, this includes service level performance, turnaround time, et cetera, as depicted on the slide. But the next level partnership thinking really requires us to link these metrics to business value outcomes with an appropriate reward and sometimes penalty mechanism. And from our perspective, the key here is to strike a balance between impact and influence. So if we take an example in the marketing space, you may clearly want to incentivize a partner to drive new customer acquisition. You could link an incentive to top line revenue, but there's so many other extraneous factors that impact this, so the influence is low. Therefore, the better approach may be to set the incentive at the actual level of new customer acquisitions in a specific geography or maybe business unit where this agency is operating. Put in place some level of financial incentive linked to the increases in new customer acquisition above the baseline after normalizing for any increases or decreases in spend. That's an important variable. And this could be a great way to creatively incentivize the partner to drive the desired business outcome based on what's actually under their sphere of influence and incentivize them accordingly. And then the last area we have to cover is the partnership infrastructure. So really want to emphasize here not to underestimate the importance of infrastructure in order to enable the partnership, particularly in a transformational environment. You can have the best culture, strategic alignment metrics, but none of this means anything if you can't operationalize and sustain the partnership. So to draw upon the life sciences client procurement externalization example, a clearly defined governance structure with top-level sponsorship was key, but we also needed a structure that embraced multiple layers of the organization, category teams, regional hubs, process owners, and a regular exchange at different cadences depending on the audience related to alignment on ideation of priorities, project updates, KPIs, challenges, optimization opportunities really helped ensure the full alignment of the team. And then secondly, a clearly defined op model and RACI, roles and responsibilities. Adherence to these is absolutely critical. So again, in this example, from the beginning of the partnership, we had a clearly defined, quite detailed RACI that guided our interactions. But after months of the operating model, it surfaced that some of the activity groups required more clarification to fully distinguish what was the work split and address some of the persistent gray zones that existed. So true to the partnership approach, we invested in a cross-functional team to enhance the RACI. The objective was to make it as comprehensive as possible, reflecting sort of the joint learnings from our team over the past year. We looked at it, we challenged it, we improved it, and this ability to set up a structure, a strong infrastructure, and then jointly adapt it as necessary from our perspective is really, really key to successful partnerships. So from a closing standpoint on the slides, I just wanted to round out by sharing a recognition that I'm personally really proud of, which I ties together many of the themes that we've discussed so far. So certainly in our partnership with this life sciences organization, there were many challenges along the way, but really the partnership from my perspective was defined, based on that strong aligned strategic vision, complementary cultures, and the way in which we approached and resolved those challenges that we encountered. So by really living up to the joint partnership values, the client and the GEP teams were able to transform a procurement organization within a year, and most importantly, really drive the desired business outcomes, as you can see here. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back over to Ingrid for the next phase of our discussion today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's really, really interesting, Joel. So I have a few questions, but before I go into those, I'm going to give Nico an opportunity to comment on what we just heard, and also just want to remind people to please keep those questions coming, because we will have some time for that at the end of the webinar. But before we go to that, Nico, please give us your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, really liked the framework that Joel presented there. So a lot of really interesting insights there, but that framework for supplier partnerships and all of those, different aspects of that, talking about the, cultural aspects and all of those, which I'm sure we'll touch on based on the questions that have been coming through from the audience as well. But just from my perspective as well, I think it's super important to focus a lot on supplier partnerships at this time. So obviously it's been high on procurement's agenda for a while already, but perhaps for slightly different reasons. So cost obviously shouldn't be the only reason for this, partnering with suppliers, minimizing costs and all of that. Perhaps previously when we've talked about, partner of choice strategies from, other perspectives than cost, it's probably been more around, accessing disruptive innovation from suppliers, for example. But I think right now it's really more about, resiliency and improving, access to goods and services from suppliers. And obviously there's, high inflation and these kinds of challenges as well, which having a closer partnership with suppliers will definitely, help you avert some of those challenges there. But I think it's really important also to, and I know Joel touched on this, but just kind of remember that the partnerships with your suppliers do have two sides. And I think this is sometimes a bit misconstrued by procurement teams. So you kind of perhaps might overestimate your own, power, I suppose. So essentially, if you do get to that really good, really get to build that good relationship with some of your key suppliers, build them into this kind of, proper partnership status, then you really shouldn't exploit that situation. So really just be mindful of suppliers' own requirements as well. I am going to touch on those cultural aspects a little bit, just because I think they are super interesting. And I think, again, just kind of casting mind back to perhaps a couple of years ago and what the conversation might have been before a lot of the disruption that organizations have gone through. When procurement teams would have talked about, cultural aspects with suppliers, I think it was mostly in the context of startups, for example. So how do you, align your own internal culture to be more agile and therefore be more suited to collaboration with startups, for example. But it's super important, and Joel has reminded us of this during his presentation, but it's really important to think about that from, big suppliers' perspective as well. So with the incumbent suppliers. So for example, the point about how risk averse you are compared to the supplier, I think that really hit home for me. Also things like looking at, your contractual flexibility and these kinds of things can really help build that partnership status. Just kind of jotting down quite a few notes during Joel's presentation. So perhaps the last thing to mention here is that strategic alignment with your suppliers is really crucial as well. So procurement teams, and perhaps when we talk to procurement teams, we always kind of try and drive home this point that procurement should take its cues from the organizational strategy, really figure out what are the key aspects that procurement should be, driving, and how they can contribute to the overall organizational success. So essentially just using that broader strategy as guidance for procurement strategy. And that should definitely then trickle down to the key collaboration opportunities and projects with suppliers, with the key partners that you have. So just essentially being very business aligned internally first, before then, taking all of those learnings to suppliers as well. So just a couple of thoughts that came to mind from Joel's presentation, but I'm sure we'll touch on quite a few of the other points as well when we get to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you. So just a general question from a couple of general questions from me first, and then we'll go into the audience questions. But what do you think is the biggest contribution or expectation from procurement in a time of crisis or transformation? So I don't know, should I put that to you, Joel, first, and then Nico, you're free to comment after.
Yes, most definitely. So I think the procurement organizations have an opportunity to bring sustainable solutions that are really grounded in data, and then also internal expertise. So specifically an understanding of internal priorities within a company, as well as the external market forces and opportunities. So whether this is a acquisition, a divestiture, a new product launch, a massive budget reduction, these are all transformation or some crisis situations. The data that procurement has in terms of spend, pricing trends, supplier performance is invaluable and needs to be part of the discussion. And I think what we found is the key is not just to have the data, but to find ways for the procurement organization to bring that forward in a structured way that translates into the insights. And then, of course, there's an enablement and execution angle as well. So if we take an acquisition as an example, where there's a major catalyst for synergy value capture, well, clearly, as part of the supplier relationship sourcing responsibilities the procurement organization has, that group needs to be very instrumental in driving the overall M&A change agenda and synergy value capture. So really a combination of insights and execution rigor in order to help manage the period of change, of transformation, is where we've seen procurement really adding value.
Great. Nico, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree with Joel. I think there's that kind of execution and insights, perspective definitely resonates. I think, if you think of what procurement's kind of core capabilities from, skill set perspective has always been, negotiations, for example, and, doing things like cost modeling, which obviously can be, turbocharged through different, digital solutions and all of that good stuff. But I think there's definitely kind of newfound appreciation for those capabilities. So from our experience, at least based on some of the conversations we've had, is that stakeholders are more proactively coming to procurement for those capabilities now. So that's definitely a testament to all the good work that procurement has been doing. But then it's also, if that's more of the kind of practical here and now aspect of what procurement is doing, there's also the more future-proofing aspect for procurement's capabilities, especially in this time of polycrisis, if you want to use that particular word. But there's a lot of board level discussion about near shoring and China plus one strategies and these kinds of things. So essentially redesigning your supply chains more holistically, and obviously procurement is really at the center of this in the from the perspective of finding new suppliers and all of that kind of good stuff. And then, sustainability can kind of be seen as a bit of a transformation as well, because it also really changes how companies operate and how supply chains are designed around that. So all of that information and, intelligence gathering is something that procurement can definitely contribute to. So I guess, just to summarize a bit, maybe the crisis or whatever, challenges, disruptions we're going through that should definitely be seen as a bit of an opportunity for procurement as well. So obviously it elevates procurement status internally a bit because you get the seat on the table definitely quite naturally. And then you're also perhaps from suppliers' perspective, looking at the partnerships, you're in a quite a good position to forge new, perhaps long partnerships with suppliers if you're investing in those relationships, while other customers of those suppliers are actually squeezing them at this difficult time. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities for procurement to contribute to these more strategic goals of the organizations as a whole.
Absolutely. Now, Joel, you talked a bit about culture, which was interesting. What do you think what would the best approach be to bringing two corporate cultures together during a transformation?
Yeah, definitely. So call out two particular success factors. The first is around senior sponsorship. And here there's a recognition that cultural change or merging cultures needs to be bottoms up and also top down. In our experiences, expectations need to be set. People need to be trained. There needs to be checkpoints and value assessments done along the way, mentor-manager meetings to ensure that the change is really embedded for the long term. And collaborating and demonstrating this approach at a leadership level in the early stages of partnership, we found really helps set a great example for the team. So found it particularly important to really define that common narrative and then ensure it's projected consistently by leadership teams, and then continually reinforced, particularly through the transition period when those two organizations are coming together, but also on a continual basis. And the second piece is reinforcing behaviors. So culture itself is notoriously hard to define, but what we found is you can write down key aspects of it. You can try to then bring these to life with stories and then reinforce those. So this is needed. It needs to be taken seriously, again, pushed through training, rewarding, recognizing the right behaviors within the partnership context. Within the client example that I've referenced through the presentation, one thing we did was to look at the two value structures of the organizations. We found a lot of commonalities. There was a particular guiding framework, the life values, leadership, integrity, flexibility, excellence. And we sought to take those common values and then define certain positive behaviors in the context of the partnership and giving examples of those. We cascaded that through a lot of our town halls and governance forums. We also, still to this day, set aside time on a quarterly basis to recognize individuals, whether it's part of the client organization or GEP organization, that are really living up to those life values in their day-to-day work. And we found it's fun. It's fun to learn about other cultures, explore them, take lessons as people develop their careers, embrace the diversity of thought, but then really continue, through the different phases of the partnership to reinforce those positive behaviors.
Okay, great. And Nico, this thing about culture, is this something that you hear when you talk in a community, or?
Yeah, I think indirectly at least. So we've talked about this partner of choice, dilemma, how to become a partner of choice, and culture obviously is a big part of that, but perhaps procurement needs to think about the supplier incentivization structure as one, lever to try and bring cultures together. And when I say incentives, I'm probably guessing that 70% of the audience is just thinking about money, but I'm actually talking about the softer incentives. So and perhaps Joel touched on this already, but access to senior leaders as a form of incentive, sharing about your strategy with your supplier, and just overall being more open and trusting with your information, especially if it's a bit more confidential information, just as a token of, that commitment to the relationship. So that's really important. But then also, I think it's important to emphasize that to, really enable people within procurement. So whether it's category managers, supplier relationship managers, buyers, whoever are really kind of owning those supplier relationships, they need to have first of all, the bandwidth to really think about the different ways that they can incentivize their suppliers, but then also just a bit of structure around this. So perhaps, some top-down guidance really around what kind of incentives are available to them and in what kind of circumstances they should be using them, without making it like too black and white kind of decision, but just generally giving people a bit more ideas around what they should really be exploring. And then it's just, very quickly, I think it's just the, more of kind of behavioral aspect as well. So educating people within procurement to be a bit more collaborative in their interactions. You can't really teach people to have small talk, can you? I should know, I'm a Finn, so we're very foreign to that concept. But the overall just, helping people communicate a bit more proactively and frequently, with the right language to your, whatever resonates with your suppliers. And then just overall trying to, drive much more closer engagement with the suppliers and having that, shared strategy really in mind all the time. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts there.
Great, thanks. You touched upon ownership, which was going to be my next question, and I see that's come in now from the audience as well. So who owns the supplier relationship? Is it the business? Is it procurement? What do you think? I'm going to put that to Joel first, I think, and then I'll go to you next, Nico.
Okay, great. So from our experience, most roads lead to some level of joint ownership, but some of it depends on the circumstances. So there's scenarios we've seen actually pretty commonly where a supplier may touch an organization across many geographies or business units in different ways. And individually, this may not be seen as a partnership opportunity. You look at it in the silos, but collectively it is. Perhaps there could be even hundreds of millions of spend. And the constraint is that the business organizational structure doesn't really align with this overall, the overall scale of where the suppliers are involved with the enterprise. And this is a great opportunity for procurement from our perspective to take the lead role in terms of the partnership, really be on the front foot in terms of managing and developing the relationship. Of course, engaging those core business stakeholders as part of the process. There's, of course, the inverse situation as well, where there may be a supplier that's very specific to business function or region, and there's teams even within the business dedicated to managing that supplier partnership. And here, what we found is procurement still has a role to play in terms of bringing the tools and the infrastructure, much of which we've discussed as part of today's presentation, focus on strategic alignment, enabling the cultures, while also, respecting that a lot of the day-to-day interactions are going to be handled more within the context of the business environment. And of course, there's many different flavors that sit in between sort of those opposite ends of the spectrum that I mentioned. But overall, to go back to the original point, I think we also see some level of joint ownership, but then circumstances define where procurement plays a more prominent role or where business plays that role in certain instances.
I think just jumping straight into that, I think Joel cleared the bank quite well there, so not too much really to add there. The stock answer from my perspective to that question would quite often be that, yeah, procurement should own the relationship, but I definitely agree with Joel that it doesn't always make sense. Sometimes there's very clear reasons why the stakeholder should own the relationship and procurement just contributes to that. So it's definitely not, a one-size-fits-all decision. And perhaps a couple of the things that I can bring to that to kind of add to what Joel said is what you should really be looking at is kind of the overall supplier segmentation structure. So, what are the key reasons why you might be partnering with a supplier, and then what is the best way of, really building that partnership, building that relationship with the supplier. But then also just something as mundane as, just spend data. So really looking at your, supplier consolidation figures, for example. There is, based on our research, for example, there's some categories like, MRO or professional services, for example, which are not really meeting the Pareto split of 80% of spend going to 20% of suppliers quite as well as in others might be. So then procurement can take a hard look at whether it's because they just haven't done good enough of a job inside procurement to target that spend, or are there some really serious business reasons why that spend is spread to many suppliers, and then how do the stakeholders kind of feed into that decision and that overall situation. So yeah, if there are reasons why you should really manage as many suppliers as you are managing, then probably stakeholders need to be much more involved in owning those relationships. So yeah, just a couple of things that procurement can think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just bring in one of the audience questions now. So I think this is probably directed initially at you, Joel. In terms of strategic alignment and mostly what you wanted to get out of the partnership, how easy or hard was it to reach an alignment internally? Sometimes I feel like we're aiming at too many goals, which makes it hard to conclude a single proposition.
Yeah, most definitely. So I think what we found effective in this environment was to define a vision. We refer to it as a lighthouse, a North Star that purposely is a bit more vague and doesn't get into all of the details in terms of exactly how it's operationalized or enabled. And true to sort of describing a vision, we were looking more 3 to 5 years in the future. And that really gave us a framework. So that vision, that North Star, plus some principles about how are we going to work together as a team, linked to some of the cultural points, were really the foundational elements. And then within that, we had a subset of priorities. And in some instances, there were very clear matches between the priorities of the organization. But naturally, I mean, just because it's a partnership doesn't mean all the priorities necessarily need to be the same. We as a service provider need to manage our overall cost portfolio, the footprint of our resources, are the partner that we have, the client, has also other, metrics that they're accountable for as an organization. But the key was putting those out on the table and very much in a structured, and we actually do this very commonly throughout the partnership when we have certain key topics to discuss or align on, being very open and saying, hey, this is a top priority for us, and this is a low priority for the client. And then where do we have the intersection, and where we have the mismatches, that becomes an area for us to invest time and effort in a structured way, taking it piece by piece. Because to the question, it can get it overwhelming. There are so many different priorities, but that framework, understanding what's common, let's go after it, what's different, what we need to work through, all still sort of linked, and we sense check it against the North Star, has been really helpful to keep us organized and address some of those topics.
Great. So just to kind of round things off, how should procurement teams decide? I mean, how do we decide which suppliers they should build a partner of choice with or a relationship? What's the criteria here? I mean, you talked a little bit about culture and stuff, but what else is coming into play?
Yeah, so I think Nico touched upon it a little bit in terms of the supplier segmentation frameworks. So a lot of these exist. There's a lot of similarities between them, but generally they're in some form or fashion assessing the criticality, impact, strategic nature of a supplier relationship. And again, to Nico's point, we recommend starting with the spend data. It's not all about the spend, but that's important. Starting with some level of structured stratification of the supply base, but then what comes next? In terms of just deciding where you really invest the time and effort in the partnership. So you have to be selective in a constrained environment. Next step we'd say is then talking to the business stakeholders, understanding their perspective on the suppliers, the criticality, how it's being managed, the prominent role that procurement can play in that process. It's hard to treat a supplier as a partner just as procurement if the business isn't also aligned to do the same things. That alignment there is essential, I'd say. And then thirdly, you need to talk to the supplier and understand their perspective. So supplier can be super important to you, but you may not be important to them at all. And that's not really a great environment for a partnership either, and could lead to different considerations in terms of how you set up your supply base. But overall, starting with spend and the stratification, segmentation of suppliers, complementing that with the business stakeholder buy-in, and then cross-referencing to confirm there's actual interest and willingness from the supplier, really the steps we'd recommend going through.
Great, thanks. Just a couple of audience questions that actually came through us a little earlier. How do you measure the success of supplier relationship partnership?
So here, so clearly if the right metrics and incentives are in place, that's a way more quantitatively to measure progress. But we've also found it's really important to proactively solicit inputs from a broader group of stakeholders or constituents in terms of how the partnership is evolving. So how does this work? This could be a call it like a health check survey, or some sort of pulse check, or bringing teams together in working sessions to solicit feedback. But some mechanisms outside of just the core targets in order to take a pulse of the contributions. And ideally, what you want to see is an evolution. It doesn't necessarily need to be drastic, but I mean, the partnership's either stagnating and headed the wrong direction or the right direction. And those quick sort of pulse checks give a broader enterprise view of how it's progressing, and it covers, to the point about talking about issues, helps direct a lot of those conversations on issues or hard topics that then can be proactively addressed within the frame of that partnership collaboration we've been discussing.
Right, now you said earlier it's impossible to do a presentation in the spring of 2023 without talking about AI. So what are some of the strategies that we can use to leverage AI to enhance the relationships?
Yes, most definitely. So I think a lot of this, there's a lot of different platforms on the market that enable supplier collaboration, and those specific platforms, whether that even be providers like Salesforce, we see and their supplier collaboration modules incorporating certain elements of AI in terms of how those interactions with the suppliers are enabled. So there's one element around the collaboration platforms themselves. But to us, what's really compelling is, to some of the points I mentioned earlier, making sure that we're positioning the right supplier to our stakeholders at the right point in time in the overall buying process and journey. And it's not just a supplier name. It's also using some of this generative AI technology to synthesize lots of information from category strategies to policies to performance data, and then in a user-friendly interface, allow requisitioners to understand and interact trends, supplier capabilities, supplier recommendations, and ultimately those suppliers that are partners and performing well and have data to substantiate that performance, or then it's going to present opportunities for them to grow and to develop their business in other ways, as we look to really make that match between a demand and a supply partner.
Brilliant. I think that's all from my side. I'm just going to put you both on the spot and just ask if you wanted to give people kind of one key takeaway, something for them to help them on the journey following the conversation today. What would that be? Sorry.
I can jump in.
First?
I can
just a quick summary. Just a quick summary of the session would be brilliant. What's the kind of one key thing?
Yeah, it's really hard to summarize just one thing, but I think, I mean, there's surely a lot of, leaders, managers on the line here who are responsible for teams. So especially for those people, I definitely just recommend, thinking about ways of formalizing some of this stuff. So I know that might sound a bit off-putting actually, because we're talking about things like culture, which is, you know, inherently quite a soft subject, so it's a bit intangible. But then the more you can put guide rails in place to help your people really succeed in building the right kind of environment with your suppliers and with your internal stakeholders as well. I think a lot of those learnings apply to internal aspects as well. Then the more successful, the easier it becomes for these people to really, you know, position your organization as the partner of choice for your suppliers. So if I had to summarize just one thing, that would probably be it.
Perfect, thank you. Final thoughts, Joel?
Yeah, from my perspective, I mean, a lot distills down to a mindset shift. And I know this mindset exists within some areas, but the vast majority of the time, the sentiment is still, what can we get out of the supplier, which is, you made those points as well, Nico, and it's that paradigm shift to say, what can we jointly achieve? And then from that cascades, all sorts of opportunities and potentials as we've discussed over the course of today's session.
Fantastic. Well, we're nearly out of time. Thank you so much, both of you. Really great conversation. I've very much enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone listening have enjoyed it equally as much. So I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Please take the time to do the quick survey at the end and check out the additional resources. But that's all for us today. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day, everyone, and hope to see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.